to welcome back to First Christian Spiritualist Church my very dear friend, Douglas Barker. He's a wealth of knowledge and has done worldwide tours on histories. Douglas is an art history instructor, professional light worker, and a passionate world traveler. 14 years residence in England, Germany, and Switzerland, and spiritual experiences in sacred sites around the globe that changed his life forever. His spiritual journey has been long and eclectic. Among his most formative experiences, 3 years of study of the teachings of Rudolf Steiner in England, and a training in his alternative system of education, the Waldorf schools, initiation as a disciple of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh Rao as Osho. Earning his diploma in astrological counseling from the Astrological Psychology Institute near Zurich, after 5 years of study in Germany and Switzerland. Initiation as a priest of Wicca. Initiation in the use of the Native American prayer pipe with Medicine Man in Arizona. 4 years residence in Sedona. And ceremonies in Peru with ayahuasca, frog toxin, and San Pedro cactus. And earning his certificates in mediumship and hands-on healing at Harmony Grove Spiritualist Association. Seen Douglas, I met him up at Harmony Grove Spiritualist Association years ago, and really enjoyed our conversations and all our little talks while we were up there doing readings. And we're very excited. He's going to be here for you this afternoon, offering readings if you're interested. And right now, let's welcome, please, Douglas Barker.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. My talk today is entitled, Was Jesus an Essene? And I'm going to ask, how many of you have come across the idea at some point or another that Jesus and his cousin John the Baptist came from Essene families? Well, you, okay.
I knew he was trained with the Essenes.
Yes. Well, I'll go into the whole thing. In any case, the story begins in the early spring of 1947, which means exactly 75 years ago. A group of Bedouins were crossing at that time from what was called Transjordan across the border into what was Palestine, although they didn't come in at a legal point of entry. They were smugglers and they were carrying contraband. Now, after traversing the Judean desert, they camped at a spring near some ancient ruins known as Khirbet Qumran. This was close to the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. Now, one or more of their numbers climbed a nearby cliff and discovered a cave in which there were a number of sealed ceramic jars. Now, you have to understand that the entire Jordan Valley, the Sea of Gennesaret, or Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea, this was all at one time an inland sea. And as the water drained out, the softer parts of the rock had been hollowed out into caves. Now, when the Bedouins broke the jar open, they found a number of rolled manuscripts inside, and since they were obviously ancient, they knew that they would be able to sell them to scholars. Now, the next several years are a fascinating and complex story, which I will not have to go into, involving the finding of further manuscripts in other caves as well as fragments, collecting the scrolls from different buyers, including some that had been taken to the United States, intense paleographic study of the texts in order to date them, the Israeli War of Independence, which broke out the following year, acrimonious disputes among scholars because the discoveries touched on the origins of Christianity, and the thorough archaeological excavation of the ruins at Qumran. And the results were that it was more or less established beyond any doubt that the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls were scribed during the last 2 centuries BC. They are a portion of a library of an ascetic, mystical Jewish sect. They were hidden in the caves for safekeeping shortly before the destruction of Qumran, as well as the temple in Jerusalem at the end of the Jewish War in 70 AD, and that the sect was headquartered at Qumran and was organized in ways that suggest a relationship to the early Christian churches. We know this sect as the Essenes, although that was not their own name for themselves. And when we investigate the sect and their doctrines, we find that this actually throws a great deal of light onto a number of stories in the Gospels, as well as the origins of Christianity. Now, the original scrolls discovered included 2 copies of the book of Isaiah, one of them fragmentary, commentaries on a few other Old Testament books, a collection of Thanksgiving psalms, a treatise called The War of the Sons of Light with the Sons of Darkness. This was an apocalyptic text. It was similar to the Revelations of St. John. And a so-called Manual of Discipline, which was actually the rule of the community at Qumran. Most of the scrolls today are in the so-called Shrine of the Book, which is part of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And when I took German groups on tours of Israel, I would take them through the ruins at Qumran and show them the caves, as well as take them through the Shrine of the Book. Now, we have to go back a little bit further in history, namely to 333 BC. Alexander the Great was on his conquest of the Middle and the Near East, and he entered Jerusalem in that year. And when he did, he granted the Jews their autonomy, and in the new city that was founded on the coast of Egypt and named after him, Alexandria, he set up a Jewish colony in the city. And since this city became a major trading port and center of ideas of all sorts, it also attracted a lot of Jews from Palestine who came to settle there. Now, it was completely imbued, as you might guess, with Greek culture. And it was Greek philosophy, Greek aesthetics, the idea of what is the beautiful, Greek physical culture, exercising naked in the gymnasia and performing games and so on, Greek ethics, Greek religion. All of this spread very rapidly with Alexander's conquests through the Near and Middle East. And by the time of Christ, Jerusalem was now ruled by Rome, but it was still to a great extent a Greek city in terms of its culture. Now, the conflict between the Greek and the Jewish cultures eventually led to open warfare and a tremendous time of troubles by about the middle of the 2nd century BC, about 150 BC. And by that time, the Jewish religious establishment was dominated by 2 opposing religious parties. Now, in a number of places in the New Testament, we hear Jesus make a reference to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They were the opposing parties. Now, if we go back to the time of King David, he had a major priest whose name was Zadok, Z-A-D-O-K. And under his son Solomon, who built the first temple, Zadok became the high priest of Israel. Now, his descendants were the Zadokites, that's what we would technically call them, but eventually in English that becomes Sadducees. Now, these were people who were religiously very liberal. They were open to the strong influence of Greek culture because what they needed to do was come to a rapprochement, a kind of an agreement with the Romans, the Roman authorities. And the Romans themselves at the time, they were under the spell of the Greeks too, if you look at the Roman gods. Now, the Sadducees were also the party of the temple hierarchy. They were the establishment, in other words. They were the party of the aristocracy among the Jews. They were very political and they were eager for increased power and wealth. The Pharisees, on the other hand, they were the more popular party. They, on the other hand, were quite conservative in terms of religious matters and following Jewish religious laws. They were opposed to Greek culture, and they were less interested in personal politics. They, however, were very eager for liberation from Rome, and they said that that would come about through the appearance of the Mashiach, which in English is Messiah. Literally, that means an anointed one, like a king. He would be a, quote, son of David, descended from King David, who would rule Judea as a priest king. Now, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, the Sadducees, of course, ceased to exist, and the Pharisees would be instrumental in laying the foundations of modern-day rabbinic Judaism. The most fanatical among the Pharisees, by the way, were splinter groups like the Sicarii and the Zealots. One of Jesus' disciples was Simon the Zealot, and they were open to even carrying out political assassinations and other terrorist acts. But there was a third religious party, the Essenes. This was a Jewish sect that had separated themselves off from these two opposing religious parties, as well as from the official priesthood in Jerusalem. What they desired above all was to lead lives of strict ritual purity and adherence to all of the traditional Jewish religious laws. They believed that they were the only people who rightly understood the Jewish scriptures, and that they would have a pivotal role in history. Quote, preparing the way in the wilderness for the new world order which would be brought about by the Messiah. I should also point out that we know much of our Christianity from the Greek language because of the way the New Testament was written. Mashiach, or Messiah, in Greek is Christos. Now, they said that he would be a divinely appointed ruler, and also that the Messiah would be preceded by a prophet. It would be Elijah returned, or if you like, reincarnated. Now, we know about the Essenes from 4 ancient Roman writers, including Pliny, the great historian, who said that the Essenes numbered over 4,000 in Palestine, and that originally they had avoided cities due to their evils and temptations. However, by the time of Christ, they had branches in many cities. They also mentioned that there was a group in Alexandria and nearby around Lake Mareotis in the north of Egypt who were known as the Therapeutai. In other words, they were specialists in healing. And it appears that they probably worked with higher angelic energies in their healing practices. But by the late 3rd or 2nd century BC, many of the Jews living in Alexandria and in Egypt no longer spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, so everything had to be communicated in Greek. Hence, they were known as Therapeutai. They were Greek-speaking Essenes. Now, the center at Khirbet Qumran was an institution that was very much like later Christian monasteries. It contained a scriptorium for the copying of manuscripts. They found ancient inkwells that contained remains of dried ink, as well as shards of pottery that were used for them to practice their penmanship. There was also a pottery there where the jars were made, and the ruins are only about a half a mile from the caves. The center operated monastically, but Essenic sects seem to have had a considerable variety in their practices, and there was no central authority. They held to a life of strict piety and ethical living. They were known for their kindness and their charity. They would assist the poor and the needy, regardless of their beliefs. Even King Herod had good things to say about them. Those at Qumran lived a life of asceticism and much contemplation. They had 2 large bathing pools, which figure in their rituals. And when they looked at the cemetery, there were about 1,100 graves there. Many of them were graves of women. Most of the Essenes apparently practiced celibacy, but they did have one branch in which marriage was permitted. After all, they had to have some way to provide for the Messiah. And also among them, according to the ancient writers, were some who were able to predict the future. The Essenes rejected animal sacrifice, such as was practiced at the temple in Jerusalem. They also rejected slavery, and they refused to take oaths. They had no private ownership of property. All their wealth, as well as any wages they earned, were surrendered to a common treasury. and then a steward would be appointed in order to disperse monies for expenses. Now, some of their beliefs and practices appear to have come from Zoroastrianism, the major religion of Persia. Between the 6th and the 4th centuries BC, the Persians actually were in charge of the entire Near East, and they even conquered Egypt. Now, they believed, like the Zoroastrians, that since the beginning there had been a war between the so-called sons of light and the sons of darkness, which appears in Zoroastrianism as the struggle between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. Each morning, the Essenes, like the Zoroastrians, would pray facing the sun, the source of light. They also had a strongly developed angelology in both of these religions, and they were enjoined, the Essenes that is, never to reveal the angelic names to outsiders, which suggested they were probably used in incantations. Moreover, the Essenes believed in the immortality of the soul and a type of judgment after death, which were also Zoroastrian beliefs. Now, Orthodox Judaism doesn't say anything about it, although the Pharisees also tended to believe in immortality and a judgment. At Qumran, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and then again at the end of the workday, they would stop their work, don white robes, and then wash themselves in one of the bathing pools in cold water as a purification. So it was like a twice daily baptism. Following this, they would go into the refectory, the dining hall, and partake of a sacred meal, including bread and wine, which was presided over by a priest, and then they would sing songs of thanksgiving. Now, we note that there are a number of amazing similarities between the Essenic sects and the very earliest or primitive Christian communities. The members of each community were known at large as the many, and in each community they would pick out 12 men who would represent symbolically the 12 tribes of Israel. These were the 12. The communities, both of them, Essenic and early Christian, held all of their goods in common, and they were overseen by a kind of inspector superintendent. And they also had rules for penalties for fraud in connection with the common fund. Each had a rule requiring any accusations made against another member to be made at first privately, then, depending on the sect, if it had to go further, in the presence of either 2 or 3 witnesses, and if necessary, it would then go before the many. And that was a rule that was practiced only by the Essenes and the early Christians. Now, I mentioned before that the Essenes did not call themselves Essenes. It's a little bit complicated because we have our New Testament, of course, in Greek, and many of the manuscripts, the ones that describe the Essenes, were written in Latin and using the Greek names. But the Greek name itself seems to have been an adaptation into Greek from something that was either a word or a phrase originally in Hebrew or Aramaic. And depending on what the word was, it would have meant either the pious or the outsiders or those who practiced the Torah, the law of Moses. What did the Essenes and the early Christians actually call themselves? Well, interestingly enough, by a wide variety of names, and they used the same ones. They would call themselves the saints, the brethren, they that believe, they that are in Messiah or in Christos, they that are of the Lord, sons of God, sons of light, the disciples, the meek, the poor, etc. Now, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives the Beatitudes. One of them says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." He's referring to the Essenes. And in another one, he says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And also, the Essenes and the early Christians both used the term blood of the Lamb. Baptism, in both cases, admitted one into a community that expected the Messiah or anointed one or Christos. Both considered themselves to be people of a new covenant, which is exactly what New Testament means. Now, there was a manuscript, an ancient writing known as the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. This was known to religious scholars, but who found it a rather puzzling Christian document. However, it was found in the caves at Qumran, showing that it was actually pre-Christian. And it was not used as one of the books in the Bible. It didn't appear in the canon, but it was used as a source book for the earliest Christian writers. And we find elements of that treatise appearing in many of the sayings of Jesus and in many of the statements of St. Paul. Both groups saw a cataclysmic end to the struggle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The sacred meal of both groups involved blessings over bread and wine, which I should point out was also something that was practiced by members of mystery sects that existed at the same time, like the Mithraeans. And the community at Qumran very much resembled later Christian monasteries. Now, if Jesus and John the Baptist were both raised in Essene families, and Jesus and his disciples were an Essene band, the 12, it would explain about a dozen stories in the New Testament. First of all, when the Holy Family flees to Egypt in order to escape King Herod, why did they go to Egypt? It wasn't because they wanted to see the pyramids. It was because there were Essenes already there, the Therapeutae, and they would, of course, be welcomed by them and taken in. Now, the place where Jesus grew up, Nazareth, in Hebrew, Nazaret, during the second half of the 20th century, a lot of religious scholars believed that, in fact, it didn't exist until late in the 2nd century AD, because that's the first time we ever find any reference to it in writing. Now, it seems that they've done a little more research and they found out that, no, there were people living there much earlier than that. In fact, the earliest people living there were living there in 30,000 BC. At the time of Jesus, Nazareth was only a very tiny little village, which is why no one mentioned it. It consisted of maybe 400 people. Now, the problem is a bit of the name here, because we're reliant on the Greek, and they were, of course, reliant on the Hebrew in turn. But Nazareth may actually have been a community of Nazarites. We hear about them in the Old Testament. They were very pious individuals who had taken a special vow of asceticism and personal purity, and it could be for a period of a number of years or for their entire lives. The rules were laid down at the time of Moses. You can read them in the book of Deuteronomy. And men who were Nazarites included Samson, the prophet Samuel, and James, the so-called brother of Jesus and one of the disciples. Now, the later sect of the Essenes had very similar aims to the Nazarites. So the Greek term Nazarene that we have from the New Testament, that may have referred to the same people, and was also the term, by the way, that was used by outsiders to refer to the earliest Christians. They were known as Nazarenes. Now, John the Baptist, we read in the New Testament, was an ascetic hermit who lived in the Judean desert. Well, that's exactly where Qumran is located. And he probably lived in one of the caves there. That was common practice for hermits. We see the same practice, for example, in Tibet. John the Baptist taught very similar doctrines to the Essenes, and he was a baptizer. And Jesus and some of his disciples were baptized by John. Now, when we read about the baptism of Jesus in the book of Matthew, immediately after the baptism, Jesus spends, quote, 40 days in the wilderness. This was probably at Qumran. He was probably dwelling in one of the caves and spent much of his time fasting. Now, another thing that's surprising is when he calls the different disciples, some of them just immediately lay aside whatever they were doing, including their tools, and get up and follow him. Well, this wouldn't be necessarily just the charisma of the Master Jesus. They were members of the many, and they were waiting for their opportunity to be accepted as members of the 12 by a master teacher who would then instruct them. The disciples carried no money, no food, and no extra clothing, because they would be received and cared for by people in the Essene communities where they were automatically entitled to hospitality. At one point in the New Testament, Jesus says, "Many are called, but few are chosen." He's referring to the many and the 12. Jesus is obviously not a Sadducee or a Pharisee, and the Essenes were the only other choice. In one story, Jesus is met by a rich man who wants to know what he needs to do to be saved. Jesus says to him, "Go, sell all that thou hast and give to the poor, and follow me." He was telling the man to join an Essene sect, and then he could be taken on by Jesus as his teacher. Now, the blessing over the bread and the wine at the Last Supper, this is a bit speculational, but that may have been the standard liturgy of the Essene sacred meal. And when the celebrant would say, "This is my body," etc., he is speaking for the Messiah. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels, and they're quite similar in many ways, but the Gospel of John is very different. The language is more sonorous and liturgical, and it's strikingly similar to the language that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. When Jesus resurrects on Easter morning, however you want to understand that, the account says that he is seen in the tomb with two men in white raiment, and it's usually interpreted that they were angels. No, they were Essenes wearing their white robes, and they were giving him healing or facilitating his resurrection. And then following the ascension, the disciple James, who was raised as a Nazirite, becomes the head of the entire early Christian community in Jerusalem. And in the Bible it says, "To him only was it given to enter the Holy of Holies." Well, that's something that only the high priest did at the Temple of Jerusalem on Yom Kippur, one day out of the year. So perhaps the Essenes had their own temple, because we do know that they had their own synagogues. So it would seem fairly clear from the evidence that the earliest Christian communities were made up of Essenes who had accepted the messiahship of Jesus. And then a few decades later, it would fall to St. Paul to spread this message to the Gentiles. However, here we have to add one more thing, and that is that if Jesus had been nothing more than an outstanding Essene teacher, he might well have just disappeared into history without leaving any trace. But instead, the Master Jesus, or Yeshua ben Yosef, as his actual name was, he went beyond the Essenes in many ways, and he comes across as a strong and independent teacher. As it says in the Gospels, he taught them as one having his own authority and not as their scribes, the people who simply copied the manuscripts. And among the differences, we would note the following. First of all, unlike the Essenes, Jesus was not an ascetic. He accepted hospitality freely. He drank wine, and he consorted with, quote, publicans and sinners, which means tax collectors and their women. A friend of mine in England got a different interpretation, because in that country, a publican is a person who runs a pub. Now, and he used that as his experience to have a few times. Now, the Essenes were very particular about rules of precedence. When they would go into the refectory and have their sacred meal, they would go by order of rank. However, Jesus rejected that. He had no use for it. He told his disciples that the greatest is the servant of all, and he even washed the disciples' feet as a demonstration. The Essenes felt bound by their religion to hate the, quote, evil ones, but Christ told his followers to love your enemies. The Essenes were very strict about keeping the Shabbat, the Sabbath. But Jesus and his disciples were not above picking grain to eat on Shabbat when they were hungry. And when he was criticized by a man nearby, Jesus replied, "The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And he was not above mocking the Pharisees and for their self-righteous obsession with rules of purity. And finally, and most significantly of all, Jesus undoubtedly identified himself with the Messiah, and John the Baptist with the returned Elijah. And although he fulfilled many of the prophecies that were done in the Old Testament, he quite obviously saw the role of Messiah in very different and in very universal mystical terms than the Essenes, who expected an earthly ruler of a Jewish kingdom. And Jesus also anticipated that not all Essenic groups would accept his teachings and his messiahship. This would account for his injunction to the disciples, where he says, "And whatsoever place shall not receive you, and they hear you not, as you go forth then shake off the dust under your feet for a testimony unto them." And finally, to put it in a nutshell, as a universal spiritual master, Christ taught, "My kingdom is not of this world, and the kingdom of God is within you." Thank you.
Wow.